welcome to Chock's Hangar. Don't worry, I'm not gone mental. Just while I'm stuck in the house making videos and stuff like that during the COVID crisis. One of the things I have been doing is, if you like computer games, you might be interested in this. Nothing really to do with flight, but what I've been doing is playing the new version of Mount & Blade, which is called Mount & Blade Bannerlord, so medieval fighting and all this kind of stuff, hence the silly hat and the silly song. But not completely unrelated to what we're reviewing today, because if you fast forward about 500 years from the period that's set in, another famous general, because I've been messing around playing a medieval general in that game, another famous general of World War II, namely Eisenhower, named several things that he thought were war-winning tools. And you can find various versions of that quote, but the four things generally that people say that he named were: 1, the bazooka; 2, the Jeep; 3, the atomic bomb, which is definitely a war-winning weapon; but 4 was the C47, otherwise known as the Douglas DC-3 Dakota. And this week, Aeroplane Heaven have released their DC-3 and C47 Dakota package for P3D, and so what we are going to be doing is we are going to be reviewing that. So don't worry, I've not gone mental. And the observant amongst you will know that this actually isn't a medieval hat, it's a Roman soldier's hat, but or helmet I should say, but it's about as medieval as I've got in terms of silly hats, and I normally wear a silly hat. Anyway, without further ado, the Aeroplane Heaven DC-3 C47, let's check it out.
So, the Aeroplane Heaven C47 and DC-3 is available in 3 different versions. There is a bundle package that includes all of the C47 versions and all of the DC-3 versions, or you can buy just the C47s or just the DC-3s. If you buy the bundle package, you get everything. It costs you €72. If you get the C47 package, you just get the military versions, and that costs you €43. If you go for the DC-3 versions, but not the military versions, that will cost you €47. Now within that, these are all genuinely different models. They've got different virtual cockpits, they come with different door configurations. The military versions come with different cargo loads, they can drop paratroopers and stuff like that. The commercial versions for the airliners have different door configurations, different engines, different seating arrangements and all this kind of stuff. So they are genuinely 2 separate products, the C47 and the DC-3. So if you're thinking €72 for a bundle package is a bit steep for one plane, it's not really one plane, it's 2 planes. Now what we can see here while I'm talking is we can see one of the C47s, but I bought the entire package, so I'm going to be looking at the entire package, the bundle. But as I'm talking, keep an eye on this and you'll see what it does. It can drop paratroopers, and you'll see that in a moment or two after it's taken off. So while we're watching that, I'll give you a little bit of the history of the DC-3. I don't think I need to go into massive details because most people know a fair bit about the DC-3 and the C47, but if you don't, I'll give you a little bit of a story about it. In the 1930s, all of the airlines in the United States were struggling with the aircraft that they had. They were typically using things like the Curtiss Condor, the Ford Trimotor, the Fokker F7 and the Fokker F10. All of those aircraft could only carry about 10 passengers, and not even very economically. Most airlines had to supplement the passenger routes that they flew by flying mail as well. So what they were on the lookout for was more commercially viable aeroplanes. So the airline manufacturers in the States in the early 30s started working on that, and one of the first airline manufacturers to actually come up with something of that nature was Boeing. They came up with their Boeing 247. Now, all of the airlines were interested in it. It got displayed at the World Fair in 1933, and all of the US airlines were like, yeah, that's fantastic. However, there was a problem. Boeing was part of a huge conglomerate called United Aircraft Transport Corporation. There were lots of companies in that corporation. Boeing was one of them. Hamilton Standard that made propellers, Pratt & Whitney that make engines, Chansport that made Navy fighters, Stearman that made biplanes, and what eventually became United Airlines was in that corporation as well. So that meant that Boeing only wanted to make and sell their Boeing 247 to United Airlines because it was part of the same company. So that left all the other airlines in trouble because they couldn't buy this Boeing 247. So they contacted other aircraft manufacturers. Now, chief among this was Transcontinental and Western Airlines, TWA. They tried to buy the Boeing 247, got told, sorry, by Boeing, sorry, we're not selling it to you. So TWA contacted Douglas, who said, yeah, we'll develop an aeroplane for you. However, you would think that that would be an easy thing to do. You'd think that all Douglas would need to do is look at the Boeing 247 and go, yeah, okay, we'll make something sort of similar to it. However, 247 was the first airliner capable of taking off on one engine. It was a good aeroplane. So TWA wanted the aircraft that Douglas were going to make for them to also be capable of taking off on one engine. However, there was a bigger problem than that, and it was this. That's right, Albuquerque. TWA specified that not only did the aircraft that Douglas were going to make for them had to be able to take off on one engine, it had to be able to take off on one engine from every airport that TWA operated in and out of, and that included Albuquerque. And Albuquerque is 5,300 feet above sea level with an average temperature of 90 degrees, so it's a bit of a tall order, but nevertheless Douglas did manage to do that, and you think, fantastic. However, then TWA, whose technical advisor was Charles Lindbergh, who I'm sure you've heard of, suggested another specification that the new Douglas airliner would be capable of, and that is that it had to be capable of flying over every mountain that was on a route that TWA flew on one engine. Now that was a bit of a problem because it included this. Colorado, Rocky Mountain High. I've seen it rain and fire in the sky. The shadow from the starlight, soft and lullaby. Rocky Mountain High, Colorado. Rocky Mountain High, Colorado. That's right. The Rocky Mountains in Colorado. Now, the Rocky Mountains in Colorado include Mount Elbert, which is 14,400 feet in height. So the new Douglas airliner that they were creating for TWA had to be able to take off on one engine at hot and high airports, including Albuquerque, and it also had to be capable of maintaining 14,400 feet on one engine with passengers, and Douglas managed to do that. They built a prototype which they called the Douglas Commercial 1, the DC-1. They only built one of them. TWA accepted it, they used it for a while, eventually they got rid of it, and it ended up in Spain fighting on the Republican side. But you never knew that about the DC prototype. DC-1 ended up as a bomber in Spain. But production-wise, Douglas tweaked the DC-1 a little bit and made the DC-2 for TWA. They were very happy with it. Lots of other airlines that couldn't buy the Boeing 247 bought the DC-2, and it was all fantastic. However, American Airlines, who were using the Curtiss Condor, flew sleeper routes with their Curtiss Condor, where they had 12 bunks in their plane whilst it flew across the USA. And what they said to Douglas was, can you make a slightly bigger DC-2 that we can fit 12 bunks into? And Douglas were kind of like a little bit reluctant to do that, but American Airlines said, if you do, we'll buy at least 20 of them. So Douglas thought, that's going to be quite lucrative. So what they did was they stretched the DC-2 a little bit, added a dorsal fillet to it so that it had better longitudinal stability. They gave it a slightly bigger wingspan, but they made the wings thinner, so it was a bit more aerodynamic. But the important thing was they widened the fuselage to be able to fit those sleeper bunks in. And when they did that, they realized that what they could do is they could fit more seats into the thing. So the aircraft that was built for American Airlines, technically it wasn't a DC-3, it was called the DST, the Douglas Sleeper Transport. But after Douglas had made that, they started producing them with a normal passenger seat arrangement on it, and that was the DC-3. So there was never really a prototype for the DC-3. There was a prototype DC-1 that was made into the DC-2. Then there was an enlarged version that was the DST, the Douglas Sleeper Transport, made for American Airlines. And from that, the DC-3, and then from that, when the military were interested in buying it, it became the C47, known as the Skytrain. Sometimes it's nicknamed the Goonie Bird in RAF service. The DC-3, the RAF called it the Dakota. So got lots of different names. There are two engines that you typically find on a DC-3. Most military versions have a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp engine. If they don't have that, they have a Curtiss-Wright R1820 Cyclone. You get both of those engines and all the different variations in this Aeroplane Heaven package. So let's have a look at the thing in a little bit more detail. Right, so let's have a look at the Aeroplane Heaven C47 and DC-3 package in a bit more detail, because we want to find out if this is justifying its price. Now, €72 for the bundle package with the C47 and DC-3, €43 for the C47 on its own, and €47 for the DC-3 package on its own. So that translates into pound sterling of roughly about 64 quid for the bundle, probably about 35 quid ish for the individual two on there. So, you know, it's not massively expensive, but it's still a chunk of change. So does this justify the price? Well, one of the things that would justify the price is the standard of modeling and the standard of texturing. Is it good, and is it noticeably better than anything else that you can get? Because there are other payware DC-3s that you can get, there are other payware C47s that you can get that cost less, and there are free DC-3s and C47s that you can get. So this had better be able to come up with a good. So let's have a look at it close up and see what we can see. So overall, you can see that it's a very nice model. No problems with it proportion-wise, size-wise, or anything like that. It looks like a DC-3 as you'd expect it to. So it's a good model in terms of shape and the amount of polygons that it uses and what have you. But let's have a closer look, shall we? So here we go, looking at the cockpit. Now, good detail on the riveting, good detail where you can see inside and all the cockpit's detailed, good modeling of the pilots. Things like the windscreen wipers and the pipes on the front of the windscreen are very, very well detailed. You can see on the right hand side, you can see PBR textures on the antenna on the side of the fuselage there. So this is very, very well detailed. Now, sort of make a mental note of this, because we're going to be looking at a freeware one and another payware one, and you can compare what this looks like to those. But before we do that, let's have a look at some other things on this DC-3. So moving on, here we are on the engine. Now, this is of the two engine options that you could get on the DC-3, this is a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp 14-cylinder radial engine. Now, a little bit about the engine. 1,830 cubic inches of displacement, which is why it was called the R1830. If you work in metric, that's 30 litres displacement, this engine, so a lot more powerful than your car, and certainly going to use a lot more fuel. Fuel-wise, this used the Twin Wasp used between 95 and 100 octane fuel, so it could boost a little bit better than the alternative engine that you could get, which we'll see in a minute or two. It weighed 1,350 pounds, sorry, 1,250 pounds, sorry, which gave it a power to weight ratio of 96 horsepower per pound. Early versions of the Twin Wasp were about 800 horsepower. Late versions were about 1,200 horsepower, and the ultimate versions of it were about 1,350 horsepower. So it was a good engine, and it was the one that most of the military organisations that were buying the C47 spec'd up. Now you can see that this is a nicely detailed engine. There's good texturing on the cowling with bits of paint scraped off. And what have you, so it's very nicely modelled. Keep in mind how well this is modelled. You can probably just about see on the casting housing behind the propeller boss that there is a Pratt and Whitney logo on the casing. We'll see that in a little bit more detail when we look at one of the C47s. So keep in mind the level of detail that we're seeing here on the engine. Now, moving on. There we go, the undercarriage. Now, again, kind of make a mental note of the level of detail on here. Very good detailing on the tyres. The tyres actually look like they're rubber. They've got all the sort of moulding on them. Up in the landing gear bay, you can see that there are bottles and wiring and stuff like that, and that's all nicely modelled. On the rear stanchion of the undercarriage, you can see that the hydraulic pipelines are sort of modelled and what have you, and that's all very nice with the sort of brass fittings and what have you. So very, very good detailing on this, all the wiring and stuff like that, and certainly a lot better than some other stuff that we'll see in a minute. So kind of make a mental note of this. Now, moving on, there we can see the starboard engine on this DC3. Now, because it's got a Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp, that's one of the identifiers that you can tell what engines a DC3's got. If it has cowling gills on the side that can open up, as these are, then you know that it's got a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp and not a Curtiss-Wright R1820 Cyclone, because the cooling method on the Cyclone was slightly different, so it had a different cowling and what have you. So that's a good identifier. But if you look at the cowling gills on this, which I've opened for the purposes of this shot, you can see that all of the mechanism that operates the cowling gills is modelled on this. So this is very, very well detailed in terms of modelling. Now, not so on other ones that you get. So if you like your detail, this thing is pretty good. Now, moving on from that, there we go, another look overall at the thing. So it's a very, very nice model, but it's not the only DC3 you can get. So let's have a look at some of the other ones. So what we're going to look at is this one. Now this is a free one that you can get. Works in FSX, works in P3D. We're in P3D version 4.4 at the minute. Now this is the Manfred Jahn / Jan Visser freeware DC3 C47 package. Now you can see that is a nice model. Now it's not quite as super duper texture wise as the Aeroplane Heaven one, and we'll see that when we look at some other shots on it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the cockpit on this thing. So we move to that view there. Now, nice, but if you look at the rivet detail and what you can see in the cockpit and the wiring and the windscreen wipers and the stenciling on the side down by the port window, you can see that it's not quite up to the standard of the Aeroplane Heaven one. It's good. But if you start zooming in real close, it's not as good as the Aeroplane Heaven one in terms of modelling or in terms of texturing. Now, moving on. Again, this is a military DC-3, so it has a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp 14-cylinder radial engine, and you can see that that's a very, very nice model. You can see that the propellers have the stenciling on them. They have the Hamilton standard logo on the prop blades and what have you, and there's a lot of detail on the engine, but keep in mind the level of detail on that, because when we look at the Aeroplane Heaven C47, you're going to see that as good as this is, it's not as good as the one, the work that's been done on the Aeroplane Heaven one. Another thing that you can note is the undercarriage detail on this is not as good, and there are less polygons making up the tyres. If you look at the top of the curve of the tyre on this shot, you can see that there's not quite so smooth curves on there. Now, of course, what that means is that this thing probably runs a little bit better in your sim with not having as many polygons and having slightly lower resolution textures. So if your computer struggles a little bit, that's another reason why you might choose to go with this one, in addition to the fact that it is free. So, you know, even if you end up getting the Aeroplane Heaven DC-3 because you want kind of the ultimate detailed one, there's nothing stopping you getting this one anyway, because it's free. Now, moving on, let's have a look at another DC-3 that you can get. This is a payware one, but it's a payware one from a few years back. So, boom. There we go. Now, this is a DC-3 from a massive package that Just Flight released a few years ago, which was their DC-3 Legends of Flight. Now, there are a lot of expansions to that. You can get C47s, it has gliders that you can tow, all that kind of stuff. And it's actually a really good package. And you can see that it works in P3D version 4.4, because I've got it in P3D version 4.4. So if you're a DC-3 nut, I think it's worth having, even if you got the Aeroplane Heaven one, because it's not that expensive. It can get expensive if you start buying all the expansions, but it's nice. If you're a DC-3 nut, you're going to like it. Now, this is a model of perhaps one of the most famous DC-3s of all time, and that is American Airlines Flagship Knoxville. Now, if you don't know about Flagship Knoxville, that was a DC-3 that American Airlines purchased in 1940, and they operated it for a number of years until they started using better aeroplanes and what have you. So this DC-3 was retired, but it kept on flying with a lot of other owners, and it was still in existence when American Airlines decided that what they wanted was a refurbished DC-3 for display. And as luck would have it, Flagship Knoxville, the aeroplane that they originally had, still existed. It was in a slightly sorry state, but it was still in existence. So what happened was Flagship Knoxville, which was in different paint scheme, was purchased, and it had a massively expensive refurbishment and repair on it and what have you, to the point where it ended up looking like it had literally just rolled out of the factory. It's in a museum in the United States now. You can go and see it, and it is absolutely beautiful. I'll show you a photograph of it in a moment or two. So this is one of the most famous DC-3s ever, which still exists. Now you could see that this doesn't model the kind of sort of polished alloy that the real thing had. It's kind of going for the sort of dull, it's been in service a few years look. Now I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because you can soup up the textures on a model in your flight simulator, whether that's FSX or P3D. You can soup it up, but if you have super duper brilliant textures on your aeroplane, but it's in a sim that has textures of a certain level, then what happens is your aeroplane sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, and it points up the fact that you're in a simulator. So there is an argument for having, you know, textures that kind of match the sim that you're in, and I think this is a good example of that, in that it's a nice model, and the texturing is pretty good. But as we'll see on the Aeroplane Heaven version of this, that's of a different order of magnitude. So let's have a look at some of the details on this thing, so we can compare it to the details on the Aeroplane Heaven one. So, boom, looking at that. Now, what we're looking at here is the other engine that you could get for a DC-3. This is a Curtiss Wright R1820 Cyclone. Now, R1820 because it had a displacement of 1,820 cubic inches, so slightly less than the 1,830 cubic inches of the Twin Wasp, but not desperately smaller. Now, what was different about it was a 9-cylinder radial as opposed to the Twin Wasp being a 14-cylinder radial. Early versions of this engine developed about 700 horsepower. Later versions of it developed about 1,200 horsepower. So it ended up developing pretty much the same as a Twin Wasp did as it progressed. But it has a slightly different power to weight ratio. The Cyclone weighed 1,184 pounds dry, which gave it an 84 horsepower per pound power to weight ratio. But it was a little bit cheaper to run because it would run on 87 octane fuel, whereas the Twin Wasp ran on 95 to 100 octane fuel. Now, obviously, the higher octane rating, the better you can boost an engine, and the less likely it is to knock and backfire. So there's advantages and disadvantages to running lower octane fuel. But nevertheless, the Wright Cyclone could run on 87 octane fuel, which you probably know if you know stuff about warplanes. Messerschmitt 109 ran on 87 octane fuel, but they used water methanol injection with it, whereas things like the P51 Mustang ran on kind of 100 octane fuel, which is why a lot of military DC3s, i.e. C47s, used the Twin Wasp, because it meant that they could use the same fuel that P51s and all that kind of stuff were using. But you can see the Wright Cyclone, there are a couple of other giveaways that tell you that it's a Wright Cyclone rather than a Twin Wasp. It has a little bit of a cap on the front of the engine fairing, on the engine cowling I should say, a little flat bit up at the top. That's a bit of a giveaway that the engine is a Wright Cyclone. The other giveaway is that it doesn't have the opening cowling gills on the side of the cowling. If you see that, you know it's a Twin Wasp. If you see that it hasn't got them, it's a Wright Cyclone. Now, it's a nice model. It's okay, but it's not up to the standard of texturing that or detailing, I should say, that the Aeroplane Heaven one has. However, you can see that the texturing is pretty good. If you look on the propeller blade, you can see that it has a Hamilton standard logo on there, and that is at a slightly higher resolution than the one on the Manfred Jahn one that we saw. But when we get to the C47, the Aeroplane Heaven one, and look a bit closer at that, you'll see that it's not quite as good as that. So it's a nice model, but it's not quite up to the standard of the Aeroplane Heaven one. Now, moving on, let's have a look at the undercarriage. Now, if you took a sort of mental photograph of what the undercarriage looked like on the Aeroplane Heaven one, you can see that this is, it's not bad, but it's not as good as the Aeroplane Heaven one. There is some detail in the undercarriage gear bay, but it's not the same level as is on the Aeroplane Heaven one. So the modelling on this is a little bit better in terms of polygons than the freebie Manfred Jahn Visa one, but it's not as good as the Aeroplane Heaven one. Notice, for example, on the rear stanchion of the undercarriage, there is not the hydraulic pipeline, and there's not any of the wires and stuff like that. So it's good, and it looks okay from a distance, but it's not quite up there with the Aeroplane Heaven one. Now, moving on from there, here we get to the Aeroplane Heaven rendition of Flagship Knoxville. Now, this, you can see, is using sort of shiny metal textures. Now, this thing looks really, really shiny. Now, if you saw some photographs of the real Flagship Knoxville, right after it was rolled out, after its refurbishment, it literally was this shiny. It was absolutely dazzlingly gleaming in the sunlight when they rolled it out. Looked absolutely brilliant. But these days, because it's in a museum and they don't polish it every day, it's kind of dulled down a little bit. It does kind of look like this, but it's perhaps not as shiny. Now, you can see from this that this is a much nicer model than the Just Flight one that we were looking at. There's just a lot more detail on the thing, and overall it looks nice. If you look on the fuselage, you can see that that is reflecting the dark area, that's the dark bit inside my Chock's Hangar scenery, and you can see the yellow text of Chock's Hangar reflecting in it, and the green of the sort of hangar door. So the reflections are really cool on this and very, very nice. More on that in a moment, but let's have a look at some of the detail on this. So coming forward, it is a Curtiss Wright R1820 Cyclone. You can tell that no opening sort of engine cowling gills on the side, and a little bit of a fairing on the front of the engine cowling. You could see the detail on the engine. It's better than the other ones. However, I do think the modelling on this and the texturing is a little bit at odds with the rest of the plane, because if you look at the aeroplane is gleaming and spotless, but the engine looks like it's seen a bit of service. And yeah, I think it would probably be more fitting if this had a really shiny engine and what have you. But you know, that's me being a little bit picky. But you know, it's an observation. So moving on, let's have a look at the cockpit area. Again, same level of detail that the other Aeroplane Heaven DC-3 had. So good riveting, you know, all that kind of stuff. Lots of detail, good modelling and what have you. But what I am going to do is I'm going to show you this. Now this, excuse me, is a photograph of the real thing. Compare that, the way the rivets reflect, with this. Yes, the sort of chrome, shiny alloy textures look impressive in the sim, but I think you'll agree that it doesn't quite look like the real thing. It's good, but you know, there's a lot more individual reflections on the rivets on the real photograph. So this is great, but you know, the people that think that, you know, PBR textures are the be all and end all of everything, and you couldn't get more realistic, clearly you can. Just before we go off this shot, have a look in the cockpit. You can see behind the pilot there is the sort of oxygen regulation system and all that kind of stuff. So really good detail on in the cockpit, even on the exterior model. You know, you can see all the sound deadening material with a little sewn quilting on and all that kind of stuff. That oxygen system does work on the Aeroplane Heaven DC-3s and C47s, incidentally. So moving on. Here we get to the Aeroplane Heaven C47 that you saw flying about at the start of this video. Very nice model, lots of good texturing on it, and you can see that it is a different model. There are a few things that point out that it's a different model, and we'll have a look at some of them in detail in a moment or two. You can see different antennas on the thing for a kickoff. You can see that it's got the rear door removed because it's spec'd up for paratroopers. You can see through the windows there are actually paratroopers inside the thing, and they're very well textured actually. We'll see one of those in a moment or two. You can see that they've put padding over the cargo door hinges so that the static lines and the equipment of the paratroopers doesn't snag when they jump out of the plane, so good attention to detail. If you look down by the side of the port engine, you can see that the exhaust stack is different from what it is on civilian DC-3s. Now that you can see some spikes on the thing. They were like little jet exhausts on the thing. Now that was very common on that type of exhaust was very common on British warplanes in World War II. The Brits used to call them hedgehog or porcupine exhausts for obvious reasons, because they've got all this spiky stuff on them. What it actually was it was a flame suppressor exhaust, because you could get flames kicking out of the exhaust of the DC-3 when it was flying along at night, and obviously you didn't want that, because at night it would give away the aircraft's position to night fighters, and the C47 was used to do night drops. That occurred in the Normandy landings. They were flying it in the early hours of the morning to make parachute drops, so they didn't want flames from the exhaust giving it away. So you see that on European theatre C47s in World War II. If you ever see anything to do with the D-Day landings, most of the time you'll see that they have those porcupine or hedgehog suppressors on them. So let's have a little bit of a closer look. Now moving in, there we go, cockpit detail. Again, very, very good. Decent riveting, better than that that Just Flight one in terms of detail, better than that Manfred Jahn one. Very good detailing on the cockpit, and they haven't used the same cockpit, nor have they used the same virtual crew. You can see that these guys are in their sort of Army Air Force, Army Air Corps A2 jackets and all this kind of stuff, and the quilted sound editing padding behind them is not the grey, it's the green of the military, and that's true of all of the all of the cockpits on these things. When you get into them, they are genuinely different. They have different controls. They've got different controls for the engines depending on whether it's got the Twin Wasp or the Cyclone engine, and so on and so forth. And just before we go off this shot, note the stenciling just below the port window where it says US Army C47 blah 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 blah. That is very much more detailed than it was on the Manfred Jahn Visser one. Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of that, especially because it's free, but we are at the same resolution here as we were when we looked at that other one, and you can see that the stenciling is much better on this thing than it is on either of the other ones. Now, on the subject of that, you'll note that the Jahn Visser one and the Just Flight Legends of Flight DC-3 both had Hamilton standard stickers on the propellers and stenciling and what have you. So let's have a look at that on this thing. So there you go, boom. Yeah, now you can see the difference. Have a look at that Hamilton standard sticker on the propeller. Not in any way low resolution. You can read every word on that thing. If you look at the propeller when it gets near the hub, you can read the serial number on the propeller blades. You can see a bit of the texturing of the propeller blade. If you look on the casting at the front of the Twin Wasp engine, you can see the Pratt & Whitney logo is there, and if I zoomed in on that, you'd see that that was really good. All of the electrical wiring and stuff like that is all there in good detail. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about better modelling on this Aeroplane Heaven DC-3 and C47. There are more polygons and there are much better textures as well. So that, if you're looking for detail on your models and you're wondering if it's going to justify the price of it, that's a tick for it, because the answer, if that's your criteria, is yes, absolutely. Now, moving on, let's have a look down here. Just to remind you, the undercarriage. Now, you probably recall when we were looking at that Just Flight undercarriage and the landing gear bay, but here's a reminder. Look at that. You can see on the tire BF Goodrich, and you know, it genuinely looks like rubber. On the rear stanchion, we can see the hydraulic lines for the braking system. The detailing on the Porcupine Hedgehog exhaust is very, very good, and what have you. You can see the reflection of some of the lights in the underside of the fuselage and what have you. You can see the rivet details good and what have you. So it's a much better model. It's better textured and it's more detailed as well. So moving on from there, boom. Just to prove that it is a different exterior model to the DC-3, you can see that this is a C47. It's a C47 from the period of the 1944 June 6 Normandy landings. So a lot of DC-3s in that period had a very early radar on the bottom that was housed in this bin. Now, it wasn't very sophisticated. It was a bit like the H2S radar that bombers used to be able to see through clouds so that they could bomb at night or on cloudy days. It couldn't really determine anything other than we're over a city or we're over fields, but it was better than nothing when you were flying at night to try and find a drop zone so you wouldn't drop your paratroopers in the middle of a town, which unfortunately did happen a couple of times. If you know anything about the Normandy landings, you'll know that some troops were dropped on Saint-Mère-Église, right in the middle of the town, which is I think it's Red Buttons plays a paratrooper that happens to, and he gets caught on the clock tower in The Longest Day movie, which is a great movie if you like DC-3s. But yeah, so not all of them had that radar, and even when they did, it wasn't the best, and it stunk as well. Now, moving to the back door, look at that. Good detail, yeah. So we can see there is a US airborne soldier ready to jump out of his DC-3 on D-Day. You can see that he is the leader of the of the squad because he has his M1A1 Thompson submachine gun. The main troops would probably have had M1s Garans or something like that, or what have you. They are all modelled, incidentally. They're all inside the cabin and what have you. The cabin's really, really detailed. About the only thing that, when I looked in the cabin, about the only thing it didn't have was it didn't have the cable running down the roof that you attach your static line to. Now that's getting really picky. But yeah, there was room for improvement, just a little bit. But you can see that that's really, really nice. And as we saw on an earlier part of the video, these guys can actually jump out of the plane as well, which is kind of cool if you like that sort of thing. Now, moving to the tail, ba-ba, PBR textures. Physics-based rendering, if you don't know what PBR is. Now, what that is it analyzes the type of texture that it is, and then it bounces light back using the graphics rendering engine of your computer to reflect things in the way that the surface it's depicting would realistically do. So rubber looks like rubber, steel looks like steel, chrome looks like chrome, and olive drab paint that's scuffed to buggery looks like olive drab paint that's scuffed to buggery. So there you go, and you can see that that's very nice. Now the trouble with PBR textures is, yes, they're great, but I'm just going to do something here to show you that they're not the be all and end all of everything. So if I zoom out on this like that, one of the problems with PBR textures is, yes, it does that scuffing, but you can see that when you get a bit far out from it, it becomes a little bit too reflective. If you look at the side of the fuselage of that thing, it's still bouncing that light off, even though at that kind of range it wouldn't really be doing it. You'd just be looking at olive drab. So PBR, yeah, it's good, it's a step forward, but it's not the be all and end all of everything, and it's one of my sort of minor complaints about PBR textures, but you know, overall they're pretty good. Yeah. So moving on to the next shot. There we go. Back when we come in, you can see PBR textures work great. Yeah? So if you look at the reflections on the engine cowling and all of the stenciling and all that kind of stuff, this is really cool. And full marks to Aeroplane Heaven for how they have textured this. It would be tempting to have this thing scuffed up and battered to hell, but you have to bear in mind that when this airplane was dropping parachutists over Normandy and what have you, it was pretty brand new. It had only just been painted, and all of the stenciling on it would have been painted neatly and all that kind of stuff. So it wouldn't have looked battered to hell. So full marks to them for that. They've done a nice job with it. So there you go. In terms of does this thing justify the price? I think in terms of the modelling, in comparison to other payware DC3s and C47s that you can get, or freeware ones, I think you'll agree that it is better in that respect. It's not the end of the story. When we start looking inside them and we start looking at the features, which we're going to do in a moment, there'll be other things that you can judge it on, but I think you'll agree with me that modelling wise and texture wise, the Aeroplane Heaven one is the winner. So here we are in the virtual cockpit of the Aeroplane Heaven DC-3. Now, this is a DC-3 with a Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp engine, and so what we've got over on the right hand side is we've got the things for operating the cowling gills there. Now, this is a really nice model of a cockpit, and all of this stuff works. It's pretty cool. So when you want to move the throttles, you have to unlatch them so that you can move them forward, and all of this stuff works. But one of the nice things about this is that that when you've got the thing running, which we'll see in a little while, when you've got the thing running, all of this stuff rattles and shakes. It's fantastic, because if you've ever been in anything like a DC-3 in a cockpit or a Flying Fortress or something like that, they rattle like mad. The levers don't just sit there doing nothing. They're rattling about and they're shaking and what have you. It's one of the reasons why these controls had friction locks on them, because there was that much vibration that they'd start vibrating and closing and what have you. And all of the needles on the gauges shake and what have you. So I think it does a really good job of conveying the fact that you are actually in an aeroplane that's shaking and rattling, more so than any other add-on DC3, either payware or freeware that I've ever seen. That is definitely a thing that lifts it above the others. Now, I will point out though that what I am doing when we're flying planes in this review is, like most people, I'm a fan of A2A, and A2A have their AccuSim and AccuFeel stuff and what have you, but what they released was they released an AccuFeel add-on that you could get for FSX and P3D that adds a bit of sort of shaking and rattling to any plane in your sim, and I use that. So if you hear any sort of brake squeals or shudders and what have you, it's A2A's AccuFeel that is doing that, and not the Aeroplane Heaven one. So if you buy this and then you go, hang on, my brakes aren't going when I put them on and do a turn, and I'm not getting tire squeals and what have you, it's A2A's AccuFeel that's doing that, and it's cheap anyway. I think it's about a tenner, you know what I mean? So I'd recommend getting that anyway, you know what I mean? Because it'll make any aeroplane better. But in terms of, you know, the actual virtual cockpit of this, it does do all that rattling and shaking. It's fantastic. We'll see it in a bit. Now, as far as starting this thing is concerned, all of these switches work, and all of those switches work. However, this is where there is a glitch on the Aeroplane Heaven P3D C47 and DC3. Now, I've been in touch with Aeroplane Heaven about this because a few people have pointed it out. And what it is that there is an issue with starting the engines if you use the proper procedure. And part of the issue is this thing. I'm just going to bring it up on screen. I'm going to hit Shift 1. Part of the thing is this. Now, you saw me using this before to release the paratroopers on the C47, but it also has a button here that says cold and dark. Now, Aeroplane Heaven have told me that that is one of the issues. There's a problem with the cold and dark button, and what it will do is it will cause a glitch. They are working on it as fast as they can go. By the time you see this video, they might even have patched it. They've already brought out a couple of hot fixes for other stuff that was related to it. So if you've got this this C47 and DC3, do not use that switch until you know that you've had the patch that resolves the issue with it, because that is one of the things that is causing a problem with it. I'll tell you what the problem is as well. If we go on the external view for this plane, boom, like that. Now, to start it, you can start it with Control plus E, or you can start it off the battery, but what you can also do is you can do this. I'm going to hit Shift E to open the forward door on this thing. You'll see that the door opens, and this happens. Yeah, the door opens, the stowable ladder comes out, a GPU gets connected, and you can start it off the GPU. You'll notice that it puts some chocks in place, and it also puts a couple of fire extinguishers. If you ever see anyone starting an old warplane like this, they always have fire extinguishers ready to go. Sadly, when there was a B-29 that they found in, I think it was the Arctic, and repaired it and were going to fly it out of there. They did all the work to repair it. They were going to fly it out of there, and then it had a fire and it was completely destroyed because they didn't have fire extinguishers to hand. So there's a salutary tale on having fire extinguishers to hand. But this is how you can start it. Now, how you do that is you click on this. I've clicked on it again. That starts, you probably heard that, that starts the GPU running, which is really, really noisy. Now, if you go back in the cockpit, which I will do, now keep in mind I haven't turned that GPU on because I don't want the racket going. When you go back in the cockpit, you can still hear the GPU, but it is quieter. But there's a bit of an audio glitch on that I found, that sometimes, you know, you can still hear it at the same volume level and what have you. So there's a couple of issues with it. But what you do is you start that, and then you come in the cockpit, and then what you do is, obviously you put your lights on because you're about to start the engine. Then what you do is you prime the fuel like that, and then what you do coming across here is you turn the magnetos off like that, and then what you do is you come down here and you put the prop levers fully forward, which they are, and you crack the throttles open a little bit, like that. I'll just move them out of the way so I can do that. You hit that lever so that you can move that throttle forward. So you move the throttle fully forward, and then you do the same thing on that one, so that you can move that one fully forward. Oh, hang on. Come on. Like that. So you get both throttles fully forward. I'm going to move the sorry, both mixture levers, I'm calling them throttles there. You crack the throttles a little bit, mixture levers fully forward on auto rich, prop levers fully forward, the supercharger on low blower, which it probably will be anyway. Make sure your fuel's selected. You don't have to worry about carburetor heat at the moment. Then what you do is you come up here. Now, because you've got ground power connected, even though I've turned it off because I'm just kind of running you through the procedure, then what you do is you put the fuel booster pumps on like that, and then what you do is you hit the energizer, which is the sort of electric starter motor that starts turning the propellers, and then what you do is you hit mesh so that the clutch engages on the engine, and then what you do is you count approximately 14 revolutions of the propeller, because what that does is, as the engine's turning, because it's cold, when it turns around, that gets the oil pump going, and it starts putting oil in the engine and what have you, because radial engines, all the oil drips to the bottom of the engine and what have you. So what that does is that turns the engine over, and you count about 14 times, and that puts some fuel in the cylinders, and then what you do is you hit the magneto switch, and then it will go. So but there is an issue with this. I found that sometimes it does not work, and sometimes when it does work, what happens is when the engine fires, the plane bounces into the air. It's like its contact points are not quite right or something like that, and it goes flying into the air and starts doing somersaults and what have you, and then your sim locks up. And Aeroplane have told me that the culprit, they think, is this cold and dark switch here. So you could manually do all those switches and what have you, or you could use that, or you could go off the battery if you wanted to. Now, some people have said, oh, this isn't realistic. You know, I've seen DC3 start and they don't use a ground starter car. It's like, yes, that's true. You probably have seen DC3 start like that. But the DC3 is a very old aeroplane now, and a better way to start it is to use a ground power car, and the fact that you could use a ground power car on the thing means that obviously it was designed to use them. Now, there's a good reason for that. The reason is that if you're starting it off the battery, what you do is you turn the battery on like that, and then what you do is you hit the energizer, so the engine's turning. Then what you do is you hit mesh to get the prop turning and what have you, and you count 14 revolutions of blades, and then you turn on the magnetos, and hopefully the engine fires. But that uses a lot of power, and you only get a few goes at it, and then your battery starts to run out, and then you wouldn't be able to start it at all. So what that makes people do is they think, oh, I've got to start it really quickly. So they hit energize, and then they hit mesh, and they count 14, and then they go, oh right, get the magnetos on and start it. And that's not great on an old engine. Whereas if you have the ground power unit connected, you're not reliant on the battery having a certain amount of juice. As long as there is fuel in that GPU and it's running, you can energize the engine for as long as you like. So what it means is that you can hit the energizer, you can hit the mesh button, you can have the engine turn without it firing, you can get all of the components all nicely oiled up and what have you, and then when it's been turning a while and there's a lot of oil in there, then you can hit the magnetos, and that is why people start DC3s with a GPU. So if you thought that was incorrect, that Aeroplane Heaven had modelled it with a GPU, sorry, you're wrong. It's the best way to start them. But as I say, there is a bit of an issue with it at the moment. Now, if you're not familiar with this sort of thing, these are two-way buttons. You hit left and right on your mouse for it, up for the port engine, down for the right engine. So that up, and then mesh upwards, 14 revolutions of the engine, and then hit the hit the left magnetos onto both, and hopefully it fires. And then when you've got that, do the same with both switches down, and then the right magneto. So that's how you start it. But you can also start it with Control plus E. Now, because there is an issue at the moment which is waiting to be patched, if you couldn't start it with Control plus E, that would be a showstopper. But it's not a showstopper because you can start it with Control plus E. However, I'm going to point something out to you here. I'm going to go back on the external view. So what we can do is we can get rid of the power cart. Boom. There we go. And we can try starting it with Control plus E. And sure enough, it starts. So, yes, until they've patched the cold and dark engine start. Now, I should have given it a bit of throttle there to get it going, because I've closed the throttles and it's not picked up. But that does show you that Control plus E can start them. Now, until they've patched it, this means that you're probably going to have to use Control plus E to start the thing, unless you want it crashing your sim or what have you, which is less than ideal. But if I know Aeroplane Heaven, they will be on the case fairly quickly with it. So, you know, it's one of those. Yeah, buy it now if you really like your DC3, or wait a week or two and they'll have patched it. Up to you. But yes, eventually you will be able to do a full cold and dark start with either the internal battery or the ground power unit, if you like. So that's kind of cool. Now, it's worth noting too that you probably know that P3D can have external switches on it as well. So if we come here and find that, there you go, you can see there. That is the open exit one. So the model does feature click spots on the outside for various things and what have you. Not all P3D models do that, but this one certainly does. So yes, absolutely, you can start it, but at the moment you have to use that Control plus E to be absolutely guaranteed that the thing will start. So that marks it down a little bit in my book, but only temporarily, because clearly they are going to patch it somewhat at some point, and probably sooner than later, because as I say, I was in touch with Aeroplane Heaven, and I know they're already on the case with it. So don't worry about that too much if you thought that was going to be a bit of a showstopper, because it isn't really. Now, probably the reason that it didn't fire, as I probably didn't have the magnetos on. I was thinking that it was maybe I had the throttle closed, but it was probably that did it. Now, stuff that works, pretty much everything you'd want to work does work. The autopilot works, but bear in mind that the autopilot is the Sperry gyro pilot. That works off there's two hydraulic systems on the DC3 and C47. One of the hydraulic systems works the brakes and stuff like that, and the other one works the gyro pilot. But the gyro pilot is not like an autopilot that you get on planes nowadays. You can't put a route in and what have you. It would just, you know, keep the thing's wings level. That's it. You still had to do proper navigation with the thing and what have you. However, if that puts you off, you can put a set of modern avionics in the thing if you want to. Yeah. So if I go up to the menu there, what we can do is we can hit GPS. Now you can get a GPS on there, but what you can do is if you've got a fancy payware GPS, you can do that too if you want. So you can have a GPS fitted and it ends up going here on your dashboard. So if you've got the, you know, I know stuff, external stuff from you know, Reality XP or something like that, you can put those things in there, and it is configured for you to be able to do that if you want to. Now, there is also, if you're a bit more of a stickler for realism, there is a sextant included with this, so you can do traditional navigation. So there's this thing here. Now this is a freeware sextant. You can get this if you do a search for it. You can find it, but it is included. The Aeroplane Heaven got the license off the people that developed this so that they could include it as part of the product. And the manual has a tutorial on all that sort of stuff if you want to. The manual, incidentally, for this and the C47, it's the same manual for both of them. So if you bought the C47 or you bought the DC3 or you bought the bundle package, you're gonna get the same manual. It covers all of them, and it is actually a really nice PDF manual. Graphically, because I don't know whether you know, but I was a graphic designer for a lot of years, and I still teach people that sort of thing. So I know a little bit about graphics and stuff, and I think they've done a really nice job of it. They've made it look a bit like a wartime publication. It's got that kind of wartime manual look to it, you know, and all the kind of propaganda posters and all that kind of stuff, and it's laid out really, really well. So top job on the manual, and it explains everything in great detail, and it's really, really cool. But it's not massively long-winded. I think. I can't remember exactly how many pages it is. I think it might be 80 pages in total or something like that. Could be wrong on that, but don't be put off by that. It doesn't really take that long to read. So if you want to use this, if you want to use a sextant to navigate as they would have done on the real thing, you absolutely can if you want to, and it fits in with the DC3 perfectly, because DC3 had a radome that you could do star shots and sun readings from, and you can do all that in there. So it is fantastic that you are able to do all that kind of stuff in here. So if you want to navigate traditionally, you can do that, and if you want to fly the thing traditionally, you can. Spiral gyro pilot works and all that lot. All of these dials and switches work. All the cool stuff works. All of these things work. All of the levers and knobs and stuff for the hydraulics all work and what have you. But as a concession to people who prefer modern avionics, you can put an aftermarket GPS in it if you want to, and it has got the bog standard GPS as one of the 2D panels that you can flick up. This incidentally does have a 2D panel, by the way, if you want to use one of those. So you know, if you're a bit of a stickler for 2D panels, it has got one. Now, as I say, all of this stuff works as well. So all of these, you know, like the hydraulic levers and what have you, it all works. And this is something that will probably catch people out. With the DC3. DC3 had a little bit of a weird landing gear system. Not terribly weird, but part of it was because the DC3 didn't have any up locks on its landing gear. So what would happen is the wheels were fairly heavy on a DC3. So what would happen is as it would fly along, the wheels would slowly lower. If you were flying the thing for, you know, 3 hours or something like that, the gear would start dropping down because there were actually no up locks on the thing. And so there is a kind of weird latching system on the DC3. Now, the DC3 was designed so that the wheels would stick out from the engine nacelles a little bit, so that if you had to belly land it, it would still land on its tyres, because obviously the tail wheel doesn't retract. So if you belly landed it, as long as you came in pretty smoothly, you'd probably only damage the propellers and maybe the antennas that were underneath it. And you could even steer it on a belly landing because the as long as you had hydraulics, the differential braking on the wheels would still work. So that's kind of interesting that you could steer when you'd done a belly landing. But yeah, so you can do that on this thing as well. So yeah, the virtual cockpit, I think it's really good. Now, it's sort of related to this. Is we looked at the Jan Visser and Manfred Jahn freeware DC3, and we looked at the Just Flight Legends of Flight DC3. Now, you can pretty much equate how they are in terms of external model and texturing standard with the virtual cockpits on them as well. This thing, the Aeroplane Heaven one, does have the best virtual cockpit. The Manfred Jahn one isn't far behind it, and some people might like that it's perhaps a little bit more sort of photorealistic. Yeah, I know, you can find out for yourself because you can download the thing for nothing. It's not even a big file size, to be honest. The Just Flight one is a bit more, yeah, I think people sometimes use the description cartoony. You'll probably know what I mean if you've seen a few Just Flight add-on aeroplanes. It's got that kind of, it's okay, I kind of like it, but it's not as good as this. So in terms of virtual cockpit, this thing has the best virtual cockpit. Now, realism-wise, one thing that it doesn't do, which might disappoint people a little bit, is if you know A2A stuff, where they do all that AccuFeel stuff, AccuSim, and what have you. If you abuse the hell out of your engines, they'll start braking and what have you. This doesn't really do any of that sort of thing. Now, that doesn't stop you taking care of your engines and using them properly and what have you. So it doesn't stop you simulating it. It's just that if you don't simulate it, you're not really going to break the engines. So there is nothing to stop you when you get to the runway and you're doing your engine run up. There is absolutely nothing to stop you putting the superchargers into high blower and running them for 30 seconds at 1,200 RPM and then backing them off after you've put them back into low blower and all that kind of stuff. You can do all that kind of stuff if you want to, but it doesn't really matter that much if you don't do that. Another thing that you had to do with airplanes like this is you couldn't close the throttles and then drop like a stone in the things, because the engines would be running fairly hot, and you had to manage the temperatures, because if you came down and they cooled too quickly, you could get shock cooling on the engines, and that would crack the fins on the engines and stuff like that. If you like that sort of thing, one that simulates that really well is Aerosoft's consolidated PBY Catalina. That's got a really good simulation of shock cooling. And that's another one that's really cool. This one doesn't do it, but there is nothing to stop you having good habits and flying this thing realistically, but it won't really matter too much if you don't. Might disappoint a few A2A fans who like all that AccuSim stuff, but it is what it is. Yeah, so it doesn't really simulate that very much. So if you like braking your aeroplane, you're not really going to be able to brake this thing very much. Now, all the radios work on it, all of these switches work, all the lights work on it, all of these levers and dials and all that kind of stuff works, with a couple of exceptions of kind of obscure switches that don't work. The vast majority of them do. So pretty much everything that you want to work will work. I had to look about really hard to find a switch that actually doesn't work on this thing, and one that doesn't work is this switch here. The landing gear lights do work. You can see wheels down and locked and the valve is in neutral, but you could dim or brighten those lights on the real thing. You don't get that option on this. Wow, what a deal breaker, eh? No, not really. So I had to look really hard to find switches that didn't work on it. But let's be honest, who cares whether those lights are bright or dim? Yeah, we're not being chased by Nazi night fighters, so I don't suppose it really matters that much. So there you go, virtual cockpit, very, very cool. Now let's have a little bit of a fly around in the thing to round off the review.
Okay, so with the caveat that the cold and dark start feature definitely needs patching, so in the interim, while we're waiting for that to happen, you're probably better off using Control+E to start the engines. That's what I'm going to do now. So here we go. Let's put the parking brake on. And I'm sure you can probably hear from that both engines have started, so not a showstopper. Yes, I know it's not ideal that it won't do a cold and dark start at the moment, or it will, but you know, it's a bit glitchy and sometimes it doesn't work. There we go. So let's fly this thing around and see what it's like. Mixture's fully rich, props fully forward. We're on low blower. Won't bother with any lights on the thing. Fuel booster pumps are on. Primers are on. Yeah, we're all looking pretty good. So off we go. So you can see there, we've just turned past the Aeroplane Heaven C47, and passing on the left-hand side, there's the Dirk Stuck designed Basler BT67, which is the turboprop version of the DC3. And over on this side, we can see the Manfred Jahn DC-3 that we looked at before. There's the other Aeroplane Heaven one with the Curtis engine, the right Cyclone. And if we could see behind us, we'd be able to see that there's the Just Flight one as well. So, and we are currently in this thing. Now, while we're on this view, here's one thing that I am a little bit critical of, and that is the propeller animation. I think the propeller animation is a little bit lackluster. It doesn't tend to reflect the throttle settings that you have. And I think that could do with a little bit of work. That's probably my only sort of complaint visually with the thing. If we start messing around with the throttles, it's not really reflected in the way the prop animations show. But, you know, I'm sure they can patch it, and I hope they do. Anyway, let's get back in the cockpit. Now, another criticism, if I've got one, is the sort of phasing sound that you get on the engines. Not a fan of that. So occasionally when it does that, I don't like that. But I think generally speaking, the engine noise is pretty good. If I just do an engine run up here before we go on the runway, I'll let you hear that. So put the brakes on and see that those mixture levers and the control columns rattling away and all that kind of stuff, like an old plane like this should. And if we go on the external view, I'll rev the thing up. And you can hear what that sounds like. Now, back inside, let's get it on the runway. Now that creaking that you can hear from the brakes there, that's A2A's AccuFeel add-on, not the Aeroplane Heaven DC-3. I like that add-on, it's definitely worth having. A2A, I'm a big fan of their stuff, and that's a nice cheap and cheerful add-on that will make any old aeroplane like this a little bit better. So, let's get the thing in the air. Now, of course, I could use the tail wheel lock to track straight, but I'm going to do it with the rudder, because this thing will get up on its main wheels fairly quickly, which means that we can steer okay. And up she goes. Quick dab of the brakes to stop the wheels spinning, because we don't want them flicking dirt up into the engine nacelles when we retract them. I'm going to cheat and use the G key to retract the gear. You can see that it simulates the fact that the hydraulic system means, the way the pipes are laid out means that one gear will normally come up a bit sooner than the other one. I shall back the throttle off a little bit, and then we'll see what it looks like from the ground as I throw it into a turn. So you can see, she looks right in the air. See if I can get it to do a flyby. Oh, we can get a bit closer than that, can't we? There we go. Now then, let's get lined up for a landing. Now, from that, you can see that this thing is not difficult to fly. I wasn't cheating there, that wasn't a replay, I was flying it on the external view. Now, the only thing that I've done in terms of messing around with the way this thing flies is from observations that I've made concerning the roll rate of the DC-3 from, you know, times that I've been on board them, or I've watched videos of them, you know, cockpit videos of them landing. One of the things that I've noticed is that, especially at approach speeds when they're on finals, the pilots are having to really deflect the control wheels a lot to make minor corrections because of the slow speed and the ineffectiveness of the ailerons at slow speeds. You've got to give it a big control deflection to get some movement. So what I did was I went into the control assignments of P3D and I dropped the sensitivity of the ailerons on my controller. So now what I can do is if I pull the speed back a little bit, I can kind of demonstrate that, and you can sort of judge whether you think the control wheel movement is sort of reasonably well representative for the flight model. I think it's pretty close. So I'm looking at the airspeed indicator there, and we are currently getting down to about 140 knots. I'm going to bring the throttles back a little bit more and give it a little bit of nose up trim to get the speed dropping even more. And now we're back to 140, 135, and I'm going to give it some quite large control deflections there. And you can see that even with quite large control deflection, the roll rate is pretty slow, as you would expect it to be on a transport category aeroplane. So I think flight model wise that's pretty good. If we look at that on the external view, I'll just bring the camera around there, and what we'll get is full left aileron, full right aileron. So this thing meanders as you would expect a DC-3 to do, because it ain't no fighter. Now, having a look there, see where our position is. Look at that, nicely. If we turn around, we can bring it in for a landing. Now, you can see that, you know, when I start playing around with this and moving about, the controls are kind of rattling about, and the mixture levers and the throttle levers start rattling about and what have you, and all of that is what Aeroplane haven't done. But what I've also got is I've got A2A's AccuFeel add-on, which I do recommend for aeroplanes like this, because it'll make them squeak and squeal when you apply the brakes, and put tyre screech on, and scrubbing noises when you're taxiing on the ground and all that kind of stuff. But that, in combination with this, is a really, really nice combination. Now, I am sure that some people are disappointed that this DC-3 is made by Aeroplane Heaven and not by A2A, and it hasn't got all that AccuSim, AccuFeel stuff built into it, where if you mishandle the engines, they're going to start falling apart and what have you. But the truth of the matter is that one of the reasons why the DC-3 is the legend that it is because it was incredibly reliable. The thing was tough as old boots, and both the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp and the Curtiss-Wright Cyclone engines were very, very reliable. You could take a lot of abuse. So I'm actually not that concerned that it's not easy to break the engines, or it's not simulating breaking the engines, because the the truth is, they just didn't break DC3s. That's one of the reasons why there are so many of them still flying. And the aeroplane is itself tough enough for there to be a modernized version of it with turboprop engines in the form of the Basler BT67. That's not the only one. There's a company in South Africa that does conversions of them as well with turboprop engines. It's a tough aeroplane, and it was very, very well built. I wouldn't be too disappointed that it doesn't simulate all that systems breaking and stuff like that, because the truth is, DC3s didn't break. I mean, obviously any machine can break, but they were very, very reliable. It was one of the things that made it very, very successful. Now, while we're on the subject of A2A and Aeroplane Heaven, big shout out to both of them. Aeroplane Heaven have made their Globe Swift aeroplane, which is kind of from the same era as the DC3, free to download for people that are stuck at home during the COVID-19 pandemic. And A2A have made their Curtis P40 free to download. So big shout out to both of them. It's just another reason why they are a couple of my favourite developers. Now, in terms of getting this thing to land, what I need to do is I need to get the speed down, because you need to get below about 115 knots before you can drop the flaps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the nose up, and I've got the throttle back, and what that should do is that should bleed the speed up. So I'm trimming it nose high, and I'm getting the speed back, and now it's getting really sloppy on the controls. And there we are. There's a little yellow marker on the airspeed indicator. We're coming up to that, and so what I should be able to do is I should be able to go on the external view and drop the flaps and gear. So down come the flaps, and that's going to pitch me down a little bit, and then also down comes the gear, and the gear is assisted by gravity, so you know it drops pretty quickly. Now back in the cockpit. Now because I pitched that up, we are really, really high on approach. But one of the great things about the DC3 is when you get the gear down and when you get the flaps down, that creates a lot of drag. And if you keep the throttle back, excuse me, then you can come in really, really steep. And what you can also do is you can side slip as well to lose even more altitude. So I can do that. So we're nose down. A bit of a side slip. That should lose us plenty of altitude. Now you can see that this thing flies really well. It's easy to get it to go where you want it to go. So too high an approach, no problem. You can sort that out really easily. Now obviously I need to sort that out, get a bit of power on. And here we go. Still a little bit high. Side slip it a bit more to lose some altitude. About enough of that. And recommended landing style for DC3 is a wheeler. Bit of a bounce, but not terrible. So there you go. How easy is that to land? Like the real thing. Now, there we are, up on the wheels. So obviously what I want to do is I want to let it drop, like that, and then I want to hold the tail wheel down, keep the thing straight. Now I don't want to brake too soon, because it'd be very easy to pitch the thing up, because the brakes are pretty strong. Now then, let's pretend we're in the RAF, get the flaps up before we taxi off the runway. Just used to get fined in the RAF for taxiing with the flaps down. The theory being that if you went over grass, you could throw dirt up into the mechanisms and damage the flat mechanism. Now let's go over the grass because we're in a DC3, so we don't need any taxiways. Now you can hear all those rattles and shakes from A2A's AccuFeel add-on. That's why I recommend that for this thing. So I guess it's time to say whether I think this thing is worth the money and worth looking at. Now, some of that will depend on how much you like the DC3. I really love the DC3 and I'm a sucker for them, so I was always going to buy this thing. But that not everyone is absolutely mad on this plane, and a lot will depend on how badly you want the best looking DC3 in your sim, because it's absolutely the best looking one. I don't think there's any argument about that when we saw the comparisons between the other ones. But if you are not too bothered about getting the absolute best looking one, then you can see that the Manfred Jahn Visa one is free and looks pretty good. Or if you don't want to spend a lot but you want to pay well one with lots of options, the Just Flight one is an option, and the Just Flight one works in FSX as well, as does the Manfred Jahn and Jahn Visa one. This is P3D version 4.4 only. I don't know whether it would work in any other sim. Can't say I've tried it. The only thing that I know that the Aeroplane Heaven is saying is that it's P3D. So 72 euros, i.e. about 64 quid, is what I paid for this entire package. I think it's slightly on the pricey side, considering it was released with a few glitches on the engine start. However, as I say, Aeroplane Heaven have said that they're working on it. I believe that they will fix it fairly quickly. And then I think it probably is worth the money if you really like DC3s. It would appeal to people more if it had some of that, or you could break the engines type thing, the kind of stuff that A2A do. But I personally am not that bothered about that kind of thing. I want to fly my aeroplane, not break it. And I tend to use this sort of thing in things like air hauler and have fun flying cargo into small airfields and stuff like that. And for that kind of thing, I'm not bothered about the thing simulating breaking down. I like the challenge of landing on difficult airstrips with no ILS or anything like that, and navigating to them using sort of old-fashioned navigation methods. For that kind of thing, especially since it's got that built-in sextant, I think it's really cool. You can feel free to disagree with me. That's what this review is about. You might not draw the same conclusions as me. I'm quite happy with it. I'll be even happier with it when they've fixed the cold and dark start thing on it. But in the interim, I'm happy to run it, starting the engines with Control plus E. It's not ideal, but you know they'll fix it soon enough. And it's not a showstopper because you've seen that I've been flying the thing around. What I think really stands out with this thing is I think it's got a great flight model that's very, very convincing. And it's a lovely looking model, and it's very convincing in the virtual cockpit in making you feel like you're actually there. The sounds are pretty good. There are a couple of glitches on the sound that they need to sort out. There are some things that could be a little bit better. For example, when you open the sliding cockpit windows, the sound levels don't go up. That sort of thing. These are little touches that could turn it from being very good into being absolutely excellent. Some little tweaks like that. But it's got a lot to recommend it. And I've shown you enough of this package for, I think, you to be able to make your own decision on that, of whether you want to spend 35 quid on a DC3, 35 quid on a C47, or, you know, 65 quid on a package that includes both of them. Entirely up to you. Anyway, that is the Chock's Hangar review of the Aeroplane Heaven C47 and DC3. Hope you liked it. If you like this channel and you want more videos like this, check out the other videos of reviews that I've done. Hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification thing, and when the next video comes out, which will probably be again this week because I'm currently stuck at home. So if you want all that stuff,
like and subscribe the video. If you've got questions about it, you can find me on AvSim, or you can post questions on the comments section of my YouTube videos, or you can find me on flightsim.com as well. And if you really want to get in touch with me, you can email me. I look forward to your comments. Anyway, that was my review. Hope you liked it. Bye.